Alrighty guys, so this is PowerPoint number 2 for the day. It'll be shorter than the first one. I know you're glad to hear that, and the third one's even shorter. So, and this is actually the third PowerPoint in the sequence for all microbes. So chapter 21 starts with bacteria. We've already done that PowerPoint. We did that in person at school. Then we did the viruses. Now we're going to do fungi, and then the last one that we'll do is protists. So for the warm-up, and like I said before, you do not have to put all of these warm-ups in your notebook to be checked later. I'll be checking the warm-ups that we did at school earlier in the semester, but all the ones that we're going to do at home during teleschool, I'm not going to check. But I do like to ask you these questions just to set the stage for what we're going to learn about. So I've asked you how fungi and plants are similar, how they're different. The reason why I ask you that question is because they were once considered plants before we knew anything about their cellular structure, what their cell wall was made out of, how they obtain nutrients, and also their genetic code. We thought they were plants. They can grow out of the ground, so that makes sense that we would mistake them for plants, but they are extremely different in how in their structure, how they obtain nutrients, and also their genetic similarities to plants are very minimal. So one of the largest organisms in the world is actually, it looks like lots and lots and lots of mushrooms. And it's in Oregon, and it's about as big as 1,500 football fields. But it's all considered one organism because underneath, all of the mushrooms are connected through this tangled root-like system called a mycelium. This is 21.4. So we've already started contrasting plants with fungi. We're going to talk about different types, how they reproduce, and how they impact us in other organisms through ecology. So, like I said, they obtain nutrients differently than plants do. Plants are autotrophs, so they photosynthesize, they can make their own food, whereas fungi are heterotrophs, and they have to obtain their food from an outside source, from some other organism, and they actually release enzymes and onto their food source that they're attached to or inside, and break it down into smaller particles that can be taken up across the cell wall into the fungus. They don't have any root stems or leaves. That makes them different from plants. And their cell wall is made of chitin. So chitin is actually a material that also makes up the exoskeletons of insects. And they are actually, fungi are more closely related to animals than they are plants. So now we'll talk about the anatomy of fungi. They're all multicellular with the exception of yeast. So yeast are single-celled fungi. All of the multicellular fungi are going to be made up of long filaments. They're branching, almost like the roots of trees. And instead of calling them roots, we call them hyphae. And they grow in a tangled mass underground or within whatever host the fungus is growing on to obtain nutrients. And then up top, above ground, you're going to have a fruiting body that produces spores for reproduction. So on here you can see we've got the fruiting body up top. That's the part that produces spores. And in this particular organism, and a mushroom, you're going to have all the spores released from the bottom. So if you were to go to a mushroom in your yard and touch the underside where the gills are, you're going to see what looks like little pieces of dirt, really, come off on your hand, or dust kind of looks like dust. Those are spores. And then underneath you've got this tangled mass in the ground called mycelium. And this is just showing you individual hyphae versus the mass, which is called a mycelium. So as I said earlier, they're heterotrophs. They do have to absorb their food from their environment. They're going to release enzymes onto their food source from their host, and that host might just be the soil, which is, it's not like they have to be parasitic, but some of them are. They'll release enzymes onto it and break down that organism into smaller parts, into monomers, before it's absorbed across the cell wall. And that's really not that different from how we obtain nutrients in our digestive system. We've got food in our stomachs and along with enzymes to help break it down. Same thing in our intestines. Your small intestine is where you do most of your digestion, actually. You can digest proteins in your stomach, but in your intestine, the small intestine, you're going to have the digestion of plants, what am I thinking? Of proteins, of lipids, and of carbohydrates. So you do a lot of your digestion in your small intestine, and then you've also got a lot of blood vessels that lie close to your small intestine, where once you've broken down those proteins and lipids and carbohydrates into monomers, like amino acids, simple sugars, or smaller lipids, you can actually have those cross through cell membranes into the bloodstream, and then you can actually use those nutrients for energy. And the hyphae extend into the food source. As I said before, they break down their food, absorb it across the cell wall. And the branching of their mycelia actually increases their surface area so that they can get a lot of nutrients very quickly, and they can grow quickly as well. And this is just showing you some branching hyphae that are branching out across some wood. So your book doesn't teach it this way, but a lot of sources, including a crash course video that I typically have students watch. I'm still undecided about whether I'm going to have you guys watch that or not, but there are three main types of fungi, and it's based on the structures that they form during sexual reproduction. So there's sac fungi, bread molds, and club fungi. So fungi can reproduce asexually or sexually, and some of them tend to do more of one than the other. It just depends on each individual species, and it depends on their environment as well. So sac fungi form sacs that are full of spores. It does include yeast, which are kind of in their own category, I guess, since they're single-celled. It includes molds. So here's an example of penicillium, which is a mold that formed on petri dishes that were growing agar at one point in time, and that's how we discovered that they could be used to treat bacterial infections. So that's where penicillin comes from. Penicillin, amoxicillin, they are derived from molds. So you can see here on this petri dish, you can see the mold in the center. Here we have the zigzag pattern. Those are the bacteria, but you can see there's a zone of inhibition right here where no bacteria grew. Here we have borals and truffles. And if you've ever had anything with truffle oil on it, usually tastes kind of salty, kind of buttery, and overpriced. So like I said, sac fungi form sacs. So there's a sac and it has spores within it during sexual reproduction, and those can be released and they can germinate, and they can be carried by wind or they can be carried by water, and depending on their environment, and they can germinate somewhere else and grow a whole new fruiting body. Bread molds spoil food, and there's two examples on here. They're actually the same type. So we used to do a lab with this, and maybe if we were in school we would be doing this lab. But here you can see some bread mold, especially if you buy bread from a bakery. It's not going to have all the preservatives that regular bread would have in it. It'll start molding over pretty quickly, and if you look at it under the microscope, it looks like this. So it actually looks like little dandelions, and those dandelions are called sporangia, and the sporangia release spores onto the bread, and it kind of looks like a dust, and then of course that gives rise to more mycelia and more fruiting bodies, which are the sporangia. Also mycorrhizae, you can kind of see them. My face is blocking it, but you can kind of see it over here. You've got the root here, and then off of it, kind of, you can see in blue that I'm doing a very bad job of showing you. On the sides, you can see something growing off of the plant root. Those are mycorrhizae. They form a mutualistic relationship with plants by helping them obtain nutrients. So this is showing you, this is like your first time seeing sexual reproduction, and it really varies based on the type of fungus. So this is just specific to bread molds. So during sexual reproduction, you'll have mycelia underneath. You'll have two cells of different types. There's not really technically male and female, there's just plus and minus. So those are the mating types. And they'll combine to form something called a zygospore. So that's what's right here. This is the zygospore. And it is diploid because the regular fungus itself is haploid. And out from that zygospore grows a sporangium after meiosis. So this actually does give rise, just like meiosis in sperm and egg, it's going to give rise to genetically unique haploid cells, which is great if conditions are unfavorable. But they can release spores without forming this zygospore and going through meiosis, in which case all the spores would be genetically identical. Club fungi include mushrooms, puffballs, and bracket or shelf fungi. And all of them form a club-like structure called a basidium, or plural would be basidia. And the basidia are what release the spores. So you've got the gills underneath, and if you look even closer underneath the microscope, even a crude microscope, they're pretty easy to see. You can see the club-shaped, like baseball bat-shaped structures, the basidia, and if you look even closer, you would need probably a light microscope for this. You can actually see the spores pretty well. So most fungi release spores. They can do sexual or asexual reproduction. So this is called alternation of generations. So we can't do that. We just produce sexually. They can do either or. So they can alternate between two different types of reproduction, and as you probably could have guessed, they're going to do asexual reproduction most of the time, and if conditions become unfavorable, that selective pressure is going to favor genetic diversity. So in that case, they'll switch over to sexual reproduction, and then there are some species that just tend to do more sexual reproduction than others, and I'm not exactly sure why they do that, but they do. One thing to keep in mind before we start looking at some more detailed reproductive cycles is that fungi are typically haploid. So we are diploid. They are the adult fungus is haploid. There's just one set of chromosomes. And if they're going to reproduce sexually, they're going to have a fusion of two cells of different mating types. And like I said before, they're either plus or minus. There's no male or female. And then they'll go through meiosis and form haploid unique cells that can then give rise to spores that are unique. And those spores can float off in the air or water, and if they land on a substrate that they can use for energy, then they'll germinate there and start growing a whole new fungus. So like I said before, sexual reproduction is going to be what they do more often if conditions are unfavorable, because it's something that we've talked about a lot. Having that increased variety is good when conditions are harsh because it increases the odds that there will be some survivors. So this is actually from an AP biology book. I think it's great because it's just really generic. So it kind of simplifies the life cycle without focusing on, you know, whether it's a sac fungi or a club fungi or a red mold. It's just showing you just really, really general, which makes it easier to learn. So you can see here we've got spores. They'll germinate and they'll start growing on new mycelium, and then you'll have a fruiting body grow up top and produce more spores. And you can see this is green. This is all happening in green because they're haploid. Later, okay, if we have sexual reproduction take place, you're going to have the fusion of two cells into a zygote, and at that point it's diploid, and that's shown in pink. They're going to go through meiosis and form haploid spores, so now we're in the green again, and then they'll germinate and grow a new mycelium. So now we'll put everything together. You can see here's a bread mold, and you can see on the left side we have sexual reproduction. We've got that zygospore down here, meiosis, and then we've got the growth of a new fruiting body, which is the sporangium in bread molds. But you can just as easily do asexual reproduction. You can release spores and they can grow into new mycelia, and you got your spore and your mycelia and your new sporangia releasing more spores. So they can do both. So fungi are really important decomposers, particularly for plants. So they're really good at breaking down leaves. They're really good at breaking down fruit. They're really good at breaking down the cell wall of plants, whereas bacteria are not as good at that. So bacteria specialize in breaking down animals. Not that they can't break down plants, it's just that not their specialty. Fungi are specialists in breaking down plant material and helping return those nutrients back to the soil. They can be pathogenic, and this includes illnesses like ringworm and athlete's foot, which I'm very sorry you can't see my picture very well, but I think you all know what athlete's foot is. They can also be parasitic for plants, so they cause Dutch elm disease, peach scab, gray mold. Here's examples of gray mold here and peach scab. And like I said before, they form mutualistic relationships with plants. They're going to help plants obtain water and minerals from the soil, and in exchange they get carbohydrates that are made by the plant. And so you can see we've got the regular plant root, and then you've got all of these hyphae here growing on the side that help increase the surface area of the root, so to speak. And about 90% of plant species use this relationship to obtain nutrients. And they've even found evidence that different plants, and not just different plants, but different plant species are actually connected to one another through this complicated system of ground. So lichens are really neat. They are a photosynthetic combination of either algae or cyanobacteria and a fungus. So they live together, and they typically are going to live, you see them on trees. You can also see them on hard surfaces. So here's an example of what a lichen looks like. And they're actually really good pioneer species that come in. They're going to be one of the first organisms that come after, let's say there's a volcanic eruption and you're starting over from bare rock. So this is primary succession. They would be one of the first organisms that comes and starts growing on that bare rock and breaking it up and allowing for soil and nutrients to start forming so that actual plants can start growing there.